I think that for a long time, people thought of additive manufacturing as a machine, and it is. But I think you get this introduction where IT goes, isn't that a server that can print parts? I think that's a cyber physical system. And so you start, to your point, to get this mindset shift where it is so commonplace to have incoming inspection for materials. Is this the same as the last batch? If I took a poll, and I do informally when we go visit people and say, do you have incoming inspection for firmware updates? How do you know when you do that nothing changed? And they go, no, I don't. And I share that to say, I think that's why this is not a Buy American economic initiative. It's very much a security initiative because of that cyber element that is inseparable from the physical nature of the machines.
Welcome to the Additive Advantage podcast. I'm Shon Anderson, joined by my co-host, Dani Mason. This is where additive manufacturing meets accountability, where we talk about turning pilots into production and ideas into outcomes. Interesting topic today. Let's jump in.
You know, over the last 6 to 9 months, we've been having the same conversations over and over again. But it's not just with customers. It's with IT teams and procurement, sometimes even with legal. And it's starting with a different question this time. Where is this equipment made? This catalyst was often seen as the NDAA, which some of you may have already read. That's the regulation that restricts the Department of Defense's use of additive manufacturing systems that were manufactured in certain foreign adversaries like China. But what's become clear is that this isn't the whole story. It's just the first enforceable signal of something much bigger. Corporate IT and security teams are tightening scrutiny on software, connectivity, data access. We're seeing primes flowing requirements down through their supply chains, and companies well outside the defense sector are also starting to feel the same pressure, often before they maybe fully understand why. And additive manufacturing sits right at the center of this shift. Modern AM systems aren't just shop floor tools. They are networked, they're software-driven production platforms handling some of our organization's most sensitive IP. So in this conversation, Shon and I want to talk through what's actually changing and why is additive being evaluated differently, why it's moving faster than a lot of people anticipated, and what it really means to be ahead of the wave, not just reacting once requirements harden, but actually positioning before they do. So with that, I want to open up, Shon. Tell me what you're seeing and why maybe this isn't a defense-only regulation.
Great question, Dani. And I think for many companies, initially, they thought this is we'll see what the federal government's going to do, but maybe we don't work in aerospace and defense. This probably doesn't really apply to us. We'll give it 5 years and see where this goes. The thing that I believe is really unique about additive manufacturing, it is literally the connection between the digital and the physical. So, I can't think of another technology off the top of my head other than maybe a 2D printer or scanner where you have such an immediate connection between the digital and the physical. And I think companies, as they bring their IT departments more into these conversations around, hey, we want to adopt this technology. And I know, and we'll get to it in a little bit, but you're seeing customers take some pretty dramatic action to change the sensitivity that they operate with around their own IP. Part of this, I think, is, and I'm going to speak purely about America because though we do business in a lot of places, I'm going to confess that I operate from a fairly America-centric view because it's where I wake up every morning. But if you think about, the size of your company, might put you on someone's radar screen. I can tell you from personal experience, I'm on the board of an organization or was on the board of an organization that was targeted with a cybersecurity threat. And this is an organization that was not large. I think people are waking up to the world that we live in. For better or worse, it is, as Zig Ziglar used to say, wherever you woke up this morning, there you are. And as you and I have talked about in many other episodes of this podcast, and we can talk more about today, one of the best practices for actually getting results from additive is having an integrated workflow and integrating it into your broader production systems. So how to do that safely is really a question that nobody has the luxury of ignoring if they want to do this well.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. In the past, this could be couched as, well, buy American. But this is not an economic strategy. This is couched as a security initiative. And that's why when we think about these regulations trickling out, to your point, far beyond defense, it's with that mindset and that vein of thinking. So it's not as simple as, well, I'll just make sure that, I'll buy the US for certain things and then I'll keep sequestered all this other equipment that maybe is made in China. But it's more complex than that because, to your point, these are cyber physical systems. Where is the CAM software written? Is it cloud connected? Are you going to get best practice firmware over the air updates so you can keep things rolling? Or to your point, are you going to sequester it, take everything offline, and you may be in compliance with your IT, but out of compliance with your best manufacturing practices? And this is what we see companies wrestling with in terms of, okay, what is the smartest, most effective way to start to move in the right direction?
Great question. And I think that's really the question companies have to ask based on their unique situation. And it comes down to a word that you and I've used a ton on this podcast. And I would say that is partnership, meaning this is not, hey, we're going to issue an RFQ and we need a printer that's, XYZ resolution, build area, whatever. Oh, and we want the software to, be compliant with the standard. And hopefully it was developed in the United States. I mean, it just isn't that simple. People have long to your point, asked that question about, well, where is it made? Where is it supported? It became very common to offshore software. Well, yes, our leader of our software team's in the US, but we have a bunch of guys in some country somewhere else that actually write the software. Or now the frontier that is kind of staring us in the face is, well, a lot of this software was developed by AI. How do you know what's in that? And you've got software professionals that are working to make sure that can be done safely, but understanding a strategy to have fail-safe points in that data and information chain that protect your organization is key. And for a long time, 3D printer companies pitched, well, everything's cloud connected. And every time you run a print, the whole system gets smarter. Well, that kind of sounds cool until you think about, well, what information is it sharing? And how can the system get smarter if it doesn't know some details about what I'm printing? Again, proceed with caution. Customers need to be having very transparent conversations, not just with the sales guy or reading some standards and nomenclature on the back of a brochure. And this is where I want to get into with you in a minute, is when we talk about what customers are specifically doing, but it's not a topic that anyone can ignore, I
Mhm.
guess is how I would wrap that up.
Yeah, and to your point about what we're kind of seeing customers doing, there's a couple veins of thought. What actually is the longest pole in the tent is requalification of a material or process, and you hope that that aligns with whatever capital expenditure budget you already asked for. And so smart organizations are not looking at it monolithically. Not I'm not going to do anything and we'll wait till regulations hit, or I'm going to blow my budget and make everything air gapped off, any connectivity and all American made. Neither approach is right. So we're seeing a lot of people look honestly program by program. And they're saying, well, is this purely an R&D activity? And is the part I'm doing of such a nature? Maybe I'm doing it as for someone in federal or defense, or for someone who's my customer's IT regulations are requiring this to happen. Okay, well, I'm going to treat that differently than something that I've already put through production. And that's a 12 to 18 month requalification process. And so a lot of folks, it's not just a which additive system should I do? It's what's the best way to make this part, both technically and performance wise, but also with the security angle in mind. Some of them are saying, I am going to keep molding this. And in the meantime, I'm going to start with a additive first approach that says, if I were to start doing this line with additive today, what questions would I ask differently? And they're not just about specs. They're everything from what can I integrate safely to where is it made to where is my team based. This whole partnership approach that you've been discussing, that's what they're pairing programmatically in order to position themselves ahead of this wave, not reacting to it. But I'll tell you what, it's coming faster, I think, than even I anticipated. Not that this is the first time a customer has said, where are you based? But it's the first time. I was just on a bunch of visits last week all over Minneapolis, and I got asked at multiple ones of them, what are you doing about this NDAA? Have you thought about materials separate from printers? Where are those sourced? Should I be worried about that? How am I going to get exemptions? What should I be asking exemptions for? So it's coming down fast, but my thrust of it is, I would say, the smart organizations are thinking about it programmatically, not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater either way.
I think well said. I'm curious, is it just the big companies you
Hmm.
see doing that? Or maybe talk to me about what you see in common in terms of the people who you think are doing this well already?
No, it's big and small. Something that we all live in is an interconnected manufacturing ecosystem. So I may be a Fortune 500, but I don't do all my own production. I outsource a lot of that to service bureaus or other companies that are, I've seen, 2 employees up to hundreds of employees. And so it's not like your supply chain evaporates when you switch to additive. There are all different size companies in that ecosystem trying to figure this out. I think the ones that are doing it well are starting with the question, what's the best way to make these parts? And if additive isn't the right fit right now, great. That's okay because I need to serve my customers first. And then they're saying, if I do pick additive, how do I need to think about software, hardware, materials, and systems integration in a way that positions me so that I'm not having to requalify this whole process a year down the line? That's very expensive to do. And so I think they're thinking about it in a much more interconnected way than downloading 5 tech spec sheets of printers and 3 material data sheets and hoping that it'll make what their part wants to do. And we're seeing a huge rise here at B9 in the systems integration work where these engineers are saying, I have a big enough day job trying to design this part and stay ahead of my competition and hit my market release timelines. I can't go look at every single thing that's on the market with this criteria and pick the best path forward. Or frankly, give me the best too, so that I'm dual sourced from the beginning instead of trying to figure that out after the fact. Will you please help me? So I would say looking programmatically at where you have the highest level of exposure or the highest level of risk in terms of your customers' demands or the parts you're making, and then figure out what should I partner with to go find the right solution and maybe even own that whole supply chain. And then when should I bring it in vertically integrated because it's so core to what I do and I have already vetted out this system that will be future proofed? At what point does that make sense? And they're going through those 3 questions very, very methodically in a much different fashion before, where I've seen people buy 5 Chinese printers off of Amazon and they say, I'm just going to dip my toe in the water. We don't want to dip your toe in the water anymore when it's a year's worth of rework if you do.
Great perspective. One of the things that I know we have seen at multiple customer sites and we've heard people talk about again and again is if you really want results from additive, you have to treat it like a production system. Obviously I'm excluding R&D activities from that statement, but when you think about treating it like a production system, again, it's a little unique. It's not an injection mold. There's no digital element present in that tool. You've cut steel, it's physical. 3D printing is different. You bring up this concern about oftentimes they're trying to find a material that meets their requirements. And until pretty recently, if somebody could find a material that, had the mechanical properties, thermal properties, maybe an off-gassing spec, whatever these things are, well, that was a win. Except that oftentimes there's only one place you could get that material. So we had customers potentially building production systems around a material that you might only get from one place that might not be a super stable place. And I don't mean geopolitically, I just mean even size of company. And so I think contractually, when you say, okay, how do we think through this methodically and then protect ourselves from a contractual and partnership standpoint, companies have got to think about instead of, maybe I buy this the way I was buying it, but do I need a clause in this agreement that says in the event they're not able to supply, they'll give me access to the formulation and I can have it produced where I want it to be produced. I may pay them a licensing fee or royalty, but things that, again, in the past, it was a material company said, well, how many kilos a year do you think you're going to buy? Okay, then here's your price. And we agree you're going to give me a 90-day firm forecast and a 12-month non-binding forecast. And that was kind of the extent of the agreement. And I think people are figuring out, ooh, that really doesn't cover me with respect to any of these other risks or potential disruptions. And, you have to combine the IT piece of your strategy with the how you're going to serve your customer part of your strategy, how you're going to produce whatever that solution is. And then how do you, from a legal and contractual standpoint, put some kind of protections in place that give you stability in a world that I think will increasingly not be stable. Unfortunately, I know as humans, we all crave stability, and as humans, we tend to not like change. However, that is just not the world we live in. Our customers who are succeeding at the highest levels with additive are thinking about these things. And sometimes it is, for instance, they may utilize B9 hardware, but they need to know in the event that something happened, if we're truly depending on this for production, we're making 100,000 parts a year plus. What would we do if something happened, whether you came under cyber attack B9 or some bug infiltrated your firmware software? I mean, people are having to think things through. I'm curious, why do you think additive manufacturing is kind of being singled out at this stage when both from a defense standpoint and just from a broader security standpoint, why are we in the spotlight?
I think that for a long time, people thought of additive manufacturing as a machine, and it is. But I think you get this introduction where IT goes, isn't that a server that can print parts? I think that's a cyber physical system. And so you start, to your point, to get this mindset shift where it is so commonplace to have incoming inspection for materials. Is this the same as the last batch? If I took a poll, and I do informally when we go visit people and say, do you have incoming inspection for firmware updates? How do you know when you do that nothing changed? And they go, no, I don't. And I share that to say, I think that's why this is not a Buy American economic initiative. It's very much a security initiative because of that cyber element that is inseparable from the physical nature of the machines. And similar, injection molding, I cut the tool. That's different. Each time it's like I'm cutting a new tool in additive and I'm bringing in a new highly sensitive part, highly sensitive part, and laying it out and orienting it in the software and then transferring it to a printer and then it's coming out the other side. And so I think you're seeing all this scrutiny among additive because it's a totally different way of making things. And people are trying to square up all the best practices I use in software and all the best practices I use in manufacturing. And those aren't the same those of an organization. And then for the first time, having to jointly buy something together and figure out how do I future-proof this from both perspectives without totally blowing my budget or my timeline or my workforce because I'm trying to meet both these regulations in step. I think that's why we're seeing all this scrutiny.
It makes a lot of sense when you frame it that way. I'm curious, you touched on a couple things that I'd like to go a little deeper on. We've commented on this show how when we're talking to a customer about, they want to use additive at scale and you want predictable results. And we say, you know, with your current provider, do you get a certificate of conformance for the
Mhm.
machine? Which sounds pretty basic if you come from a manufacturing background, but in the world of additive, it's not common. And, I would still metaphorically bang my fist on the table that if you can't get a certificate of conformance for the printer, going to be pretty tough to develop and maintain any kind of stable process. You brought up something a minute ago. Firmware. People tend to think of the desktop software and things that are maybe cloud connected, but certainly in a manufacturing environment, obviously you want control over firmware updates. At the same time, you don't want to be 52 versions behind because obviously the manufacturer has made improvements or they wouldn't have released 51 more versions. How do you deal with that? And what do we see as best practice to help a customer manage that?
So I would say best practice out in the ether doesn't exist from a lot of the different equipment manufacturers, but there are best practices internal to an organization. And we work with them in this way where we have a tool set, if you will, that acts like incoming inspection quality for firmware. Yes, I can confirm nothing has changed when you update this, and I can prove it out based on the performance of your equipment. Very similar to the certificate of conformance you're talking about, where it's moderately helpful to know something came off a factory line a certain way, but it's immensely helpful to know that performance isn't going to change over time, even as you update to the latest standard. And that is best practices in manufacturing writ large that we're starting to see a greater and growing demand in the additive space to operate under that assumption. I can't tell you how many times now I'm going into these environments and I'm not just representing an additive manufacturer. I'm talking about hybrid manufacturing. I'm talking about how this fits into their ecosystem. I'm looking at a factory floor, and there's automation, there's quality, there's tool making, there's additive, and there's production. And they're all on a single floor. And as we're touring it, we're talking about the integration in every single one of those spots. And so it's not just materials, hardware, software, and integration. It's quality and automation and production and qualification for production and what's even the signal to move from R&D to product dev forward. So we're seeing a lot of these rigors, to your point, these stop gaps in place that make sure at every single phase we are prepared to enter the next one. And that might be a good transition for you work quite a bit with a large aerospace customer who is not, a tier one prime, but they're seeing a lot of this regulation come in. How are you seeing that interface in the space where I'll call it defense adjacent, being able to react to this?
Yeah, great question. So it's interesting to me because what I think this customer is hearing from their customers. More and more, there's this what I'll call security element over here, and then what I would call manufacturing best practices here. And
Mhm.
even to piggyback on your comment about firmware, what is a QA/QC approach for firmware? How will you prove to me that before I go implement this update, nothing changed? And bringing solutions to those questions to the table for this customer. I mean, we've kind of crossed the what's going on with the hardware? How does that change over time? How do we manage that? How do we ensure conformance over time? We've crossed those bridges a while ago, and we're actively managing that along with this customer. But now it's these things that in additive seem a little higher level, but really from a manufacturing best practice standpoint, these are things that if our industry was serious about using additive at scale, we should have been working on 5 years ago. This particular customer, as you mentioned, they're not making the missile or the fighter jet. They make some of the things that go in those things. So, on one hand, their concerns are heightened. On the other hand, none of the questions that they have asked from a security lens are any different than if we just have our eye on what's good manufacturing practice. How do we protect, manage risk? I almost said protect from risk, which is different. That's hard to do. You can manage risk aggressively. And again, having a partner that you can have those conversations with. We've got other customers for whom that means they want their own dedicated version of firmware that does not change. They don't want B9's regular updates. They want a very prescriptive process that in the event we believe something does need to be updated, each of those things needs to run through an approval process. And for those customers, if they're doing this at scale, we're going to provide them with that option. I will be fascinated, or I am fascinated to see in, 2 to 3 years where this goes, because as we touched on earlier, best practice for succeeding with additive is integrating it with your other systems.
Mhm.
With back to this aerospace customer, we have integrated the additive piece into their broader MES system. Who's going to develop those, maintain
Mhm.
those integrations, tune those integrations, and prevent those from becoming weak links in that data security chain or that connected chain? To your point, you can't just air gap everything. I mean, you can and go back to using additive the way people did 5 years ago, but it's going to be really hard to get the ROI. And so complex conversations that need to happen, but these are solvable problems if you're talking to the right people at the right level.
I think too, it just bears a brief touching on part of this is personnel training as well. Do you have protocols for how you handle files, how you interact with different suppliers? What NDAs are you signing? What are they governed under? Do you know if the company is going to transition ownership, in 3 years? Do you get notified in a certain amount of time before that happens? There's all these things that don't fit neatly into a firmware update, for lack of a better word, that are education and requirements, a little like you were talking about in terms of contractual agreements. But I interface with people all day long who can't even spell legal that are signing legal documents. And that's not a slam on them or me. I'm not in the legal world either. I'm just sharing that you have these contractual obligations taking place between companies that sometimes excludes IT and sometimes excludes legal. And having the foresight to say, what should I be telling my people about different questions to ask, what to escalate, how to think forward and future focused? It's a big change there too. I don't know what thoughts you have as you work with some of these companies on the people side and how they're preparing them for a totally different environment than additive has had to exist in before.
Well, I'll take it back to conversations that we've had with people, whether it was, Blake Teipel, Todd Gagney, other people we've had on this show, that you have to involve a cross-functional team early
Yes.
on. And by that, I don't just mean the R&D team and the production team and the purchasing team. Used to be able to be called a supply chain initiative or a manufacturing flexibility initiative really is becoming, it is about data. It is about risk management. It is about, I hate to use the word compliance because every engineer who's listening will have a little reaction to that, but compliance with your legal frameworks and, how will you protect yourself? If you're really going to put this into production, how will you protect that ability to produce? Frankly, could they give you what you wanted, even if they were willing based on where they're based, how they're structured, how they're owned, some of these things that you bring up about, what does their ownership look like? And what is the long term strategy with that organization? Being able to have a very transparent conversation, cards on the table, and understand what realistically is possible. Nobody's going to essentially turn over management of their company to you just because you buy some of their technology. At the same time, there are ways you can protect yourself. And, I think the traditional things that people think about is, oh, I have, pricing and
Mhm.
delivery times and how far ahead I get a forecast. And, I need notification if a product changes. I mean, 5 years ago, those were 90% of the long term agreements we signed. Today, that's 50% of it. And the
Mhm.
other 50% is risk management.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, we didn't set out maybe to be at the center of this regulation. We obviously are US based, but a lot of this has been listening to where customers are headed and the questions they're facing from their own customers. I think maybe a good place as we kind of wind this down is how have you thought about B9 as an organization both being prepared for this new regulatory state and proactively helping our customers, partners, vendors prepare to be successful in this state?
Great question. And a little bit of this I'm going to chalk up to DNA. For anyone who doesn't know the B9 story, our founder was a US Air Force pilot. So, when you think about Mike's background and where the company started, there's some DNA there that is extremely helpful based on how this is unfolded. At the same time, there have been a number of strategic decisions for us that we believed were vital to being able to succeed in this environment. I don't want to say knowing this would come, but certainly looking ahead to a more cyber physical world, to use that term. Things like, well, what level of software capability do we have in house? Do we have a software team that just knows how to write our software? Or do we actually understand how to integrate this into customer systems and manage risk and ensure, again, we want to do a firmware update. How do we prove to a customer that the output is the same? And how do we demonstrate to a customer that changes haven't occurred that might not be desirable, even potentially unbeknownst to us? How do we take best practices for our development internally and expose those to a customer? So decisions like that we've made on top of some, mom and apple pie, I'll call it DNA, have been great. There are industries, if you look at B9 and our market focus, there are industries we used to do a lot of business in that we don't do a lot of business today because almost everybody in those spaces has decided they want the, $750 machine out of China. I do think it's interesting when I talk to some of those people who, in some cases still are our customers, in some cases used to be our customers that, I built relationships over the first 5, 6, 7 years I worked at B9. And I said, well, are you hoping your customers keep buying from you? Well, of course we are. And when I say, can they get what you make cheaper from China? Well, yeah, but they wouldn't do that. And obviously, there's a little bit of this that is from a patriotic standpoint, but I do think back to what I said when we kicked the show off, people are waking up to we need the ability to make things,
Mhm.
not just assemble things. I think it's been a wake up call for the United States when we think about not just our defense industrial base, but our industrial base in general. People are like, oh, we manufacture things. Well, do we really make them or do we just take things that were made somewhere else and bolt them together? Because there's a huge difference. And this is not going to be a 12 or 24-month or even 5-year realignment of capability. This is going to take years and years and years and years. And I could rattle everything from workforce reasons
Mhm.
to capital reasons to you name it. And I hope nobody should misinterpret what I'm saying to mean that I think all manufacturing is coming back to the US. That won't happen. But when you look at global events right now and you see different countries aligning themselves and the whole Canada China thing,
Mhm.
fascinating, right? It went from, not very many months ago, this same leader of Canada saying China was their biggest threat to now saying, well, we might be entering into this trade deal with China. And some of that I'm sure is to, maybe throw a rock back at the US or at least at the White House. But thinking about how do you align yourself and in the event of conflict, what would happen? For the United States, I'll admit I was probably a little bit lulled into a state of comfort What really woke me up was COVID. When Ford Motor Company can't get chips
Mhm.
to put in F-150s, or GM can't get chips, and we hear it a lot. We hear a lot about, rare earth minerals that go into magnets. I mean, if you think that fighter jets fly or missiles fly without those things, you don't know much about those things. And if all of a sudden we couldn't get them to make automobiles, if somebody really wanted, I bet they could limit our ability to get those things for other things. So again, long response to your question, but this kind of awakening that, unfortunately, I will say, we are in a different age globally, geopolitically. It isn't as simple as using a satellite to see where people have tanks and missiles positioned anymore. And the reality, I think, that people realize they're bad actors, and not everybody's trying to figure out how to have more rainbows and unicorns. It's just the world that we live in, and
Mhm.
it's not going to change tomorrow. So we got to figure out how to succeed in that. There is a positive side to this. The innovation that we are seeing happen at a local level, your ability to produce locally, it might not mean that you're going to do that forever, but to start companies, the opportunities for our young people that didn't exist before. It's very easy to turn on the headlines every day and see Google or Walmart or whatever company is eliminating jobs that they've automated with AI. And that's another reality that we're not going to change. But the flip side of that coin is the opportunities that are being created to actually make things
Mm.
or to play a role in making things that even 5 years ago, people would have laughed at you and said, well, that all happens overseas. That's in Taiwan, that's in China, that's in Bangladesh, that's somewhere that you can do cheap manufacturing. There are companies who are additive first companies making products right here in the United States. And I don't mean just in, your traditional centers of manufacturing, but all over the country, companies in Utah and Florida and Texas and places that if you are one of these companies and you think I might be talking about you and you want us to talk about your company on air, please shoot us a message and I'd be happy to do it. Your kids are going to have opportunities to have jobs in businesses like that. When we think about workforce, if you listen to whether it's Mike Rowe or somebody in the federal government talking about how many million workers we're missing to staff this reshoring, nearshoring, I'll call it renaissance of manufacturing in America, huge opportunities. And these are not $15 an hour
Mm.
jobs. These are, it used to be people thought about the 3 or 4 Ds, like it's manufacturing is dirty,
Yes.
dangerous, and seems like there was a third one. But this is keyboards, technology. This is not smelting metal or things like that. Obviously, that stuff has to still go on somewhere. But these new jobs I'm talking about are great opportunities for our sons and daughters that don't require them maybe to move to the other side of the country. So there's a huge, if you look at it as a cloud, huge silver lining. If you're the person that sees the glass half full, then you already saw it. But I would encourage us to think about how can we innovate, address these issues, and create opportunity. At the end of the day, that's the only way problems ever get solved. We've talked a lot about your traditional data security, manufacturing best practices. Dani, I'm wondering, is there an angle to this that you feel like we haven't even touched on yet? And maybe you've got a customer in mind that you think is going to blow us all away when you peel back the curtain?
There is. One of the most mind blowing angles for me is around biomaterials as a national security imperative. And I don't think anyone is talking about this. I mean, it's just making its way into the periphery of additive, but it's a huge, hugely important topic. And I'm very excited to get this person on this podcast and peel that back and say, well, why is that so critical to the future of the United States of America? And so if that doesn't blow your socks off, you know, I don't know what will. Mhm. There are some people we'll be bringing on that are talking about unique elements of additive that are actually of national security interest, and they're not anything that you think they would be. So we're excited about that. But if you know of someone we should talk to, or we should talk to you, reach out to us because we'd love to have a conversation about this with anyone out here and a unique perspective to share.
I think we started with the thought it would be 3 to 5 leaders who could come in and address this topic from various angles. As we are beginning to talk to people, this series may grow beyond that because everyone from the policymaking side,
Mhm.
obviously the business leader side, the technology side, the additive expert side, there are a lot of sides to
Mhm.
this issue. And so we are going to sprinkle in some of these Made in America episodes as we go. I don't think the temperature level of this topic is going to die down anytime
Mm-mm.
soon. We're going to do our very best to bring you folks who can speak from the front lines of what needs to happen to address this concern well. And yeah, as Dani mentioned, if you are one of those people or you know one of those people, please reach out to us. We'll tell you how to do that in the show notes, and we'd be eager to engage.
Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. One of many that's coming ahead about how Made in America is getting closer than you think.
Please follow us on Apple or Spotify podcasts. You can watch this episode on YouTube at the Additive Advantage podcast. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple or rate us 5 stars on Spotify. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn for updates on new episodes. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.